Well, welcome. This class is When God Moved in History, Events That Shaped Christianity. And each of the 10 weeks, we will take a different significant historical event and look at how it paved the way for Christianity. In some cases, they're going to be events like you can't have a class on what points to Jesus without talking about Jesus himself. So we'll have a lesson on how Jesus entered a chaotic world and how he, of course, changed the course of history. But we're also going to look at events that are outside the church. And how did God work through people that weren't believers, that weren't God followers or Christ followers? And tonight in particular, how did he use these historical events to pave the way for the spread of the gospel? Now, I need to tell you that I love history. I love the Roman Empire. I love the Greek Empire. I love Alexander the Great. I have not read Livy's Rome. I am not a philosopher. I can only give as much information as I have read for tonight. So if you ask me questions, I may or may not be able to answer them. And so we can feel free to share as a group if somebody has knowledge in this area or in an area that I don't. But we're going to look at the Greek and the Roman empires tonight. Two non-Christian empires that predated Jesus by centuries, and yet it is my belief that God perfectly used these pagan and non-believing empires to promote the gospel and promote the spread of Christianity in the first century AD. So I want to start with a couple of Bible verses. This one comes from Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So what is our historical context? Where are the people of God? Exile. They're in exile. And Cyrus is the Persian king. The Persians have taken over the Babylonians, who had taken over Jerusalem and taken God's people into exile. But now Cyrus has gobbled up Babylon. And so now Cyrus is the king of the country that is the world power. So in the Bible, we have this passage about Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let each survivor in whatever place he sojourns be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides freewill offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Now, I've highlighted just a couple of things. Cyrus, king of Persia, he does not believe in the one true God of Israel, the one God of the universe, but he is religiously tolerant. He is not part of the Greek Empire. He's not part of the Roman Empire. I'm using him as an example of someone that is not a God-fearer that God uses as a precursor to our lesson tonight. But he identifies God, the Lord, the God of heaven. He says, and God has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. So at some level, Cyrus is aware of who God is, the God of these people who are in exile in his country. And he is aware that God is calling him to send them back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. So an example of someone outside the promise, outside the faith that God is going to use for his purposes. Like he will, I believe, the Greek and the Roman Empire. And then this passage from Galatians 4:4, I think, also sets the tone. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. How do we define when the fullness of time had come? It seems to suggest that God had this plan, and he knew exactly what he wanted to have in place when the time would be for him to send his son Jesus. So I love this passage because it suggests that God has been at work, and once all of these pieces are in place, in the fullness of time, God is going to send his son. That is going to lead us into the Greek Empire tonight. All right, so we're going to look at 4 or 5 events, 2 from the Greek Empire, 2 or 3 from the Roman Empire, that I believe specifically helped spread the gospel and helped the cause of Christianity, particularly in the 1st century AD. There have actually been books written about this. I'm coming right back to my music stand. You guys need to tell me when I wander around, say behave, get back to the music stand. I've created an annotated bibliography. I have not read every single book on this, but I have at least sourced this, sourced my, you know what I'm saying. What am I trying to say? These are the sources that I employ. Thank you. Right. But I have not read all of them. Okay, so first, we're going to look at the Greek philosophers. What did the Greek philosophers have to do to pave the way for Jesus Christ? This is Plato. Of all of the Greek philosophers, Augustine said that Plato, more than any others, paved the way, particularly for Gentiles to come to faith in Jesus Christ. Okay, so let's take a look at Plato, who he was. He lived from 427 BC to 347 BC, so again, about 4.5 centuries before Jesus is born. But Plato spent a lot of time believing in the existence of a higher reality beyond the physical world, and he often referred to a supreme being that he called good, with a capital G, capital G-O-O-D, good. Plato was not a Christian, obviously. He predates Christ by a long time, but his belief that truth and morality must come from beyond humanity laid the groundwork for people to later consider what it means to believe in God. And again, particularly Greek-speaking Gentiles who would come to faith. So let's think about the Greeks. Think about what you know about Greek culture. What did they believe in? They had a plethora of gods, little g gods, right? So the Greeks have some semblance of believing in something outside of themselves. If you've ever read about these or read about them in history, I'm not sure these are the gods that I want to be following in my life, because they were prone to emotions, prone to anger, they weren't really gods that were looking out for the best interests of the people. But the Greeks had a belief system, and it was a pantheistic, right, culture. Plato really believed that there was something that was higher than this world. So he started to make this shift away from this pantheistic understanding of many little g gods of the Greek gods and the Roman gods, and moved into that. A distinct tradition of Christian Platonism. So when Gentiles come to Christianity, there's going to be a sect for a couple of centuries that's called Platonism, from Plato, P-L-A-T-O, Platonism. It's going to emerge in the early church, and it's going to be a syncretistic understanding, or, they're going to mesh the teachings of Jesus and some of Plato's teachings, and we're going to get to one in particular of Plato's teaching. He had something that he called the forms, which could be merged with Christianity for a new Christian that didn't understand necessarily the distinction between the two. But there's going to be this sect of Christians called the Platonists in the early church. And the Platonism was especially influential in the development of Christian theology, particularly around the ideas of heaven and the understanding of God as both divine, Jesus as both divine and human. So Plato is going to give some vocabulary and some foundation that is going to help Christians later build their theology. So he has what he calls the forms, the doctrine of the forms. This is Plato's kind of big discovery, big writing. And the doctrine of the forms says that everything that we see in this world is just an imperfect copy of a perfect form that exists in another or a higher reality. He has a pretty famous example of a cave, and if you want to go online and read about that, you can, but I find it a little creepy. So I'm going to give you another example. He also uses one of the theologians I read uses an example of a chair, When you see a chair, it might be wooden, it might be plastic, it could be tall, short, fancy, or plain. Whatever the chair looks like, but it's only a copy of the perfect form of chairness that exists outside of the physical world, okay? The ideal chair exists in the realm of what he called forms. So in this example, we have here the imitation. These are earthly things, physical things, which he would say are just imitations of the form. This example is beauty. We're looking at beauty. We have the imitation. Then we have the next level of understanding would be an individual has an idea of beauty or what is beautiful. And then the next is the concept of beauty, all of which leads the person to this outside of the physical world form of beauty. This is Plato's kind of big discovery when it comes to theology and understanding God. So what's the transition? I mean, can you see the clear, maybe parallel, not transition, the parallel to Christianity? I think in particular, I think about, Plato said our world is just a shadow of what is real. What is real exists outside the physical world. And of course, in Christianity, this life is temporary. This life is not our home. Our goal is to be in heaven and to be with Jesus, right? So we can see that there are some parallels. And as people are beginning to hear about this Jesus guy who is brand new, he's not brand new to us, but he was brand new to the world in the first century, I can see where they would say, hey, this is kind of like that guy, Plato. In particular, Augustine, father of one of our church fathers, Augustine, believed first in Plato and Platonism, and says his belief in Plato and the doctrine of the forms led him to his later belief in Jesus Christ. So he found Christianity through Plato. I think that's a pretty convincing argument that as long as you don't stay in the realm of Plato, as long as you don't say what Plato said is all of it, but as it leads you to Jesus, we can see how that could lead Augustine into an understanding of heaven, of Christ, of the understanding of this world and the world to come. In the Confessions that Augustine wrote, he speaks of how the ideas of Platonism led him to a more Christian outlook and provided the answers that he'd been looking for all his life. Platonism spoke of truth, a higher plane, of evil as the absence of something instead of merely equal physical force, and acting on the goodwill with the same amount of intensity. So Augustine's search for truth, for purpose, and for direction, according to the Confessions that he wrote, led him first to Platonism and from there to Christianity. So that's Plato's contribution to a firm understanding of Jesus Christ later, especially in the example of Augustine. Any questions or comments? Comments, not questions, comments. All right, let's go to Alexander the Great. I mean, I love this guy. He's amazing. And reading about him, this is a podcast I will never fall asleep to. He's amazing. All right, Alexander the Great. He was Alexander III of Macedon. His father was Philip II. He became king at the age of 20 when his father Philip was assassinated. He went to battle for the first time at the age of 16, and he won that battle. He led the battle, and he won that battle as a teen. I mean, think about the 16-year-olds you know now. I'm just going to let that settle in your minds for a minute. So at the age of 16, Alexander the Great led his first battle and won. In just 13 years, his conquest was larger than anybody that came before him, and one of the largest, conquests in the history. He starts in Macedonia, and you can see the red line that traces his where he went and his battles. It went all the way down into Egypt, continued over to Persia, and even into what is India today. All of that in 13 years, because he died 13 years later. So he died at the age of 33. What did Alexander contribute to Christianity that's going to come later? Every time he conquered a city, he demanded that Greek culture would be adopted and the Greek language would become the language of the city. So from Macedon to Egypt to what we know of as the Middle East to Persia to India, everyone adopted Greek culture and everybody spoke Koine Greek. With one caveat. The Jews, of course, are going to continue speaking Hebrew. But for the known world at that time, Greek is the language. So perhaps without realizing it, Alexander's goal was to Hellenize the world. What he also did was he unified the language over a vast amount of land, and that is later going to pave the way for people to be able to speak and understand in the same language. You don't have the language of the Egyptians, the language of the Persians, the language of the Indians. Everyone knows Koine Greek. And so we have a unified language, which is going to pave the way. So Plato and the philosophers planted seeds of belief in a higher power and the importance of truth outside ourselves. This gave people categories and a foundation to understand the one true God when Christians began preaching. They had some idea of what was being said and what was being taught and what was being preached, with thanks to Plato. Alexander the Great's empire gave the world a common language. And by the 1st century AD, the New Testament would be written in Greek, and the Old Testament is also going to be written in Greek. Who knows what the Old Testament, the Greek Old Testament is called? Septuagint. Yep. It's also LXX sometimes is how it's identified for the 70. So we're going to have a Greek Old Testament and we're going to have a Greek New Testament, a unified language which is going to allow people to hear the gospel. And think about the day of Pentecost. You remember when they're all together in one place and the Holy Spirit comes and it rests? And it says, I love what it says. It says everybody was speaking in their own language, but everybody understood each other. That was the power of the Holy Spirit in that moment. And it was a special, divinely appointed moment. What we have now is throughout the known world, everybody is speaking the same language. Certainly Gentiles who might later become Christians are speaking Greek. All right, so that's the Greek Empire. 2 primary contributions. Comments? Isn't this fun? Okay, cool. I love this stuff. Let's go to the Roman Empire. We probably feel like we know a little bit more about the Roman Empire because we're going to hear about the Romans throughout the Bible. And we're actually going to look at several passages that show us that the Jews lived under Roman occupation and the Roman Empire. But imagine that there was one superpower controlling most of the known world, building highways that stretched for thousands of miles and ruling with unmatched strength. That was Rome, and that was the Roman Empire. And as I've already mentioned, the New Testament takes place during the height of the Roman Empire. So first of all, let's look at a few dates. The rise of the Roman Empire is going to begin about 500 BC. But it's not really going to come into its own until 27 BC when Octavian, who's later going to be called Augustus, becomes emperor. Who ruled right before Octavian? Anyone want to guess? Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar is going to be followed by Augustus, and Augustus is going to be the first emperor of Rome, and this marks the start of the Roman Empire. In AD 117, the empire is going to reach its largest size, stretching from Britain to the Middle East. So where Alexander the Great started in Greece and went east, the Roman Empire is going to go north and west and down into the Middle East. And then the Western Roman Empire is going to fall in about 475 AD, but we're going to get that in a later lesson in here. So let's look at some of the key leaders. These are a dynasty of rulers. When I first read that, I thought it said, never mind, I won't tell you what I thought it said. Julius Caesar, I mentioned, he was assassinated in 44 BC, but he helped shift Rome from republic to empire. Then Augustus is going to be a key. He's going to be the first emperor, and Augustus is who reigned when Jesus was born. Tiberius is going to be the emperor from 14 to 37 AD, and he's going to be the emperor during much of Jesus' earthly ministry and his crucifixion. Nero, we've heard about. Nero was known to be a tyrant. He was known, wasn't he the one that was accused of burning Jerusalem, right? He was accused of that. He persecuted Christians, And Peter and Paul were likely martyred under Nero, and if not under Nero, certainly under Domitian, who would follow him, both of whom were very harsh rulers. And then they have a really good emperor named Constantine, who is going to come in about 300 AD, and that is going to be the subject of our lesson on week 5. So make sure that you come then. Okay, Ruben, is that not working? Okay. All right. So some of Rome's high points. I mentioned that they expanded all the way to Britain, but they're going to take over Gaul, what is now known as France, Britain, the Middle East, and North Africa. And they're going to build a military so powerful that Roman peace will prevail. It's called Pax Romana in the history books. The way it was explained to me when I was a college student studying the Pax Romana was it's a pressure cooker. It's an oppressive government, and they're going to keep a tight lid on the people, but the rumblings underneath and the dissatisfaction underneath is going to bubble up and explode at some point. But the Pax Romana, at least during the time of Jesus' earthly ministry, is going to keep a tight enough lid on the people that they rule that there will be safe passage for people. You will be able to travel potentially without being robbed or without pirates taking over your boat, because the Pax Romana really kept a tight lid on things. Does that make sense? So it's not great. It's not that they were great rulers. It's just that they kept such a tight lid on the people that they ruled, that it provided a level of security and safety for people that were traveling. Let's take a look at the Roman Empire in the Bible. We know all of these passages. None of these are a surprise, but I want to highlight what we find out about the Roman Empire, or how it's shown here. So who can read Luke 2, 1 through 3 for us? Is that big enough to read?
In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register.
Great. Who's Caesar Augustus?
He's Rome.
He's the first, yeah? He's the first Roman emperor.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And we hear this every year at Christmas, but it just identifies that Jesus is going to be born in the time of the first Roman Empire. How about this one from Luke 3? Can someone read that?
In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. He went into all the country around the Jordan, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins.
Great. We have some Romans that show up here. Tiberius Caesar is going to be the emperor. Pontius Pilate is Roman. Thank you for taking that. I'm sure nobody else wanted to wrestle with some of those names. You did a great job. Thank you.
They don't know that.
No, but isn't it true? You say it confidently. That's right. And no one could do better.
I've always wondered, how do you say that?
Great job. You can make your case later. All right. And this is Jesus' crucifixion. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus, and carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate, Roman, had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be King of the Jews." And Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." Again, Pilate is Roman, but I included this because crucifixion was a Roman practice. And so when they put Jesus on the cross, that was a Roman punishment. So we see, again, how much the Roman Empire is going to permeate the New Testament. Has anyone watched The Chosen? Any seasons of The Chosen? I mean, you definitely see Rome and the Romans and the tension between the Jews and the Romans. Just a couple more. Acts 18, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius, emperor, had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So another example, last one. But Paul said, I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. Again, another example of an emperor, and Paul is going to appeal. Paul can appeal because he's both a Jew and a Roman citizen. So examples of the Roman Empire that show up throughout the New Testament. They're a very real presence in the New Testament. So what did the Roman Empire, this oppressive Roman Empire that heavily taxed the Jews never enjoyed living under Roman rule, what in the world could they offer to Christianity and to the cause of the gospel in Jesus Christ? The first thing they offer, I would say, is this Pax Romana, because it, again, provided that level of safety and security for people to travel. We'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing they have to offer are their Roman roads. Look, at every red line is a road that was built by the Romans. The Romans built more than 250,000 miles of roads, and 50,000 of those are going to be paved in stone. That is a remarkable system of roads. There are a lot of very famous Roman roads. We're going to look at probably the two most famous. The first is the Appian Way. It starts in Rome and it goes southeast to the southeast corner of Italy, and it's going to be a well-traveled road, and it's still, parts of it still exist today, and you can still walk it in Italy today, which is pretty amazing to me. It was built in 312. Have you been there? Okay, that's on my bucket list. It was built in 312 BC, and you can still walk it today. That is pretty amazing. The other one is the Via Ignatius. This is the one that we're going to hear about in the New Testament. Paul is going to take this road as part of his missionary journeys. It connected from the Adriatic Sea on the west all the way over to what is today Istanbul. It used to be Byzantium. It's today modern Istanbul. It went through Philippi. It went through Thessaloniki. These are towns that we recognize, right, from Paul's travels and from places where Paul is going to build churches. The Via Ignatia was the continuation of the Via Appia. So the Adriatic Sea separates, I can't walk away from that, separates from here to there. So you cross the sea and then you pick up with the Via Ignatius and you keep going. 696 miles. The Via Ignatius, 696 miles. That is remarkable. Constructed by the Romans in the 2nd century BC as a route through really harsh territory that was largely uninhabitable. But this road is going to make it possible to travel to places much faster than by sea, which would take several weeks. And so they built this 696-mile road, the Via Ignatia. Now there's one city, if you notice about halfway, it dips down and there's a town called Kavala. Do you see that? Kavala, K-A-V-A-L-A, right in the middle? I need to be closer to that. That in ancient days, that was called Neapolis. Today it's Kavala. That is still there in Kavala today. When our church went to Greece, we walked on that. But that is a Roman road. That is in remarkably great shape. So many 2,000 years, more than 2,000 years later, it's still in great shape. What is significant about Kavala or Neapolis? That is where Paul landed in Europe first. It's recorded in the book of Acts. Neapolis is where his ship landed and where he got out to continue in Europe and going to Philippi and to Thessaloniki and other places. It's in Acts 16, 10, and 11. When Paul visited, Neapolis was an essential port in the Roman Empire, connecting Macedonia with Asia Minor. Asia Minor is what is today Turkey, but much of Paul's missionary journeys take place in and through Asia Minor. And it was Neapolis is the beginning or the end of the Via Egnatia, the Roman road that helped to connect Rome with the eastern parts of its empire. And then you see it's later going to be continued all the way over to what is Istanbul today. When earthquakes destroyed Philippi in the 8th century, the Christian population had to move away from Neapolis. Neapolis was destroyed in the earthquakes, and that's when they built Kavala. So Kavala has been in existence since the 8th century, and the Via Ignatius connects all of those cities. I mean, I just need to take a minute, y'all, to know that something that was built things that I build today are not going to last 2 weeks, much less 2,000 plus years. But these Roman roads continue today. So that's one of the things the Roman Empire is going to contribute to the cause of Christianity. Paul is going to use these roads. We know he's going to build churches in Philippi and Thessaloniki and Berea, all of which are connected by the Via Egnatia. That's the road he's going to travel to build these churches. And the Pax Romana is going to allow him to travel safely in places that were largely uninhabited or uninhabitable before. And the letters or the epistles that he is going to write to his churches are going to travel by way of the Via Egnatia. All right, so a great contribution to the cause of the gospel a couple of hundred years later. So that's the first thing, Pax Romana, the Roman roads. How about the sea? Sea trade and trading routes is another thing that the Roman Empire is going to contribute to the cause of Christianity. The Roman Empire ruled the Mediterranean. They called it Mare Nostrum, our lake, or my lake. I mean, they didn't have a confidence problem in the Roman Empire. They ruled the seas. That meant, again, that you could travel safely because of this Pax Romana and the Roman Empire's ruling of the Mediterranean. Ships are going to carry goods. Ships are also going to carry people. Paul is going to travel by ship to Rome. Other missionaries are going to travel by ship. People that accompanied Paul on his journeys are going to travel by ship. One in particular, this is where Deb Trimpe gets excited. I did not read a book about this, but I started thinking, who would have used these trade routes? And I thought of Lydia. Do you remember Lydia? The dealer of purple cloth. This is actually a picture of the baptistry of Lydia. This is the commemoration of the place where she was baptized, became a believer. She will be the first convert in her city, which is Thyatira, right? Or she was from Thyatira. She's a dealer in purple cloth. She lives, this is a painting that shows you can see the purple cloth. She is standing before Paul. She's learning from Paul in this painting. She lives in Thyatira. It's one of the purple cities on the western side of what is now Turkey and was then Asia Minor. You see Thyatira? Right here. Tyre and Sidon are right here. Why do Tyre and Sidon matter? Because that's where the snails that produce the purple dye are found. The Phoenicians cornered the market on these snails, and they cornered the market for like 1,600 years. So if you wanted the purple dye that Lydia dealt in, you had to buy from the Phoenicians in Tyre and Sidon. You see how far it is to get there. To go by land would have taken a lot of time and was largely uninhabitable. We hear from Paul's missionary journeys when he gets up into this part of Asia Minor, he talks about the dangers and the things that they had to face in there. So to go by sea route would have been easier. The Bible does not tell us that Lydia bought from tradesmen. There's nothing in there. I got fascinated thinking about Lydia, first convert, businesswoman. She had to buy from tradesmen who would deliver the purple dye from Tyre and Sidon, who would have traveled by trade routes. The Roman Empire made that possible because of their trade routes and their rule of the Mediterranean. This kind of stuff is just really fun for me to think about. Okay, so we have roads, we have ships connected to major cities where Paul planted churches: Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, Rome. all were accessible because of the sea trading routes that were opened up by the Romans. The gospel is going to spread along the same highways and sea routes as trade and news. So we have, this is an example of the Phoenician trading route. This is what I'm most interested in. Precursors to the spread of Christianity. Plato's understanding of the forms, the unified language that Alexander offers, the Roman roads and the Roman sea trading routes that the Roman empires are going to offer, as well as the Pax Romana. None of these people were Christians. None of these people lived during the, well, none of these people were Christ followers. Some of them didn't even live by the time Christ was born. Yet God used these people who were outside the covenant, outside the promise, outside the faith, non-believers, to make it possible for the gospel to spread. That's why I used King Cyrus in the very beginning of this lesson. Was he a God follower? No, he was Persian. But there was a spiritual sensitivity about Cyrus, and God used him to bring about his purpose, just as I believe God used parts of the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire to do the same. I want you to split up into some groups, and I have a couple of questions that I want you to talk together about for just a few minutes. So let's say maybe groups of 3 or 4. Here are your 2 questions. If God used Rome's road and trade to spread the gospel, what roads exist today? Think about technology, social media, global travel, that help us spread the gospel and spread the good news of God. Does that make sense? So we know that they had roads, routes, unified language. What tools has God given us now that we can use in the same way to give glory to God and to point people to Christ? All right, that's your first question. Here's your second question. How might be God using your own background, culture, or opportunities to help you share the gospel with others? What life experiences have you had that might help you share the gospel? All right, so 2 questions. Good?